It was a Tuesday morning just after 7, and the air still had that cool, honey-sweet stillness of early spring where you could almost hear the grass breathing, and the scent of the wild clover was drifting right through my open kitchen window while I stirred a fresh pot of coffee. I just finished feeding the hens, my dog Buster was dozing by the screen door, and for a split second, life on the edge of this valley felt exactly like the slice of heaven I paid for, quiet, unbothered, and mine. That peace didn't just break. It shattered the moment the ground started to shudder under my boots like a low-grade earthquake, and then came that heavy, rhythmic crunch of gravel, far too many tires, and far too much weight to be a delivery truck or a neighbor's truck. I stepped out onto the porch in my bathrobe and work boots, mug still steaming in my hand. And that's when I saw it. The kind of sight that makes your blood run cold and hot at the same time. 2 white utility trucks, a flatbed, and a massive, industrial-sized drilling rig being guided up my private drive by a crew of men in neon orange vests like they were leading a parade through their own backyard. I didn't oppose to even have time to set my coffee down before they were pulling right over my cattle gate, the one I'd left open for the propane delivery, and they didn't oppose. T slow down, didn't oppose. T look for a house, didn't oppose. T even glanced toward the porch until one of them started uncoiling thick, black hydraulic cables near my north barn like he was setting up shop at a public park. End quote. What the hell do you think you're doing on my land? End quote. I shouted, my voice cutting through the mechanical hum as I stomped down those porch steps. But the youngest worker there, a kid who couldn't oppose. T had been more than 25 with sweat already staining his safety vest, just looked at me with this blank, bored expression and said, end quote, "Water survey, sir. We've got authorization from the Ridgeview HOA board," end quote. And he just turned back to his winch like that settled it. I stood there, pulse thumping in my neck, and told him straight that this was private property and I hadn't an oppose. T authorized the damn thing, but he just shrugged, didn't an oppose. T even look up and muttered, end quote, "Take it up with the board. We're just the contractors," end quote, while the lead rig operator started leveling the jacks right into my prime grazing grass. I demanded paperwork, and what I got was a flimsy clipboard with a memo that wasn't oppose. T even a legal permit. Just a piece of HOA letterhead stating they were initiating a, end quote, drought resilience survey, end quote, for the neighborhood, and in the margin, some bureaucrat had sloppily scribbled, end quote, includes undeveloped border parcels within emergency easement allowance, end quote. I didn't oppose. T need to read the rest because I knew my deed by heart. I'd spent 15 years fighting off their offers to buy. This ridge, I paid my own county taxes, and my land was carved out of a 1940s cattle ranch long before their McMansions and manicured lawns were even a glimmer in a developer in oppose. Sigh. But none of that mattered to them because the HOA had decided to expand their reach quietly, unilaterally, and completely illegally. By 10:00 in oppose clock, the drill fired up with a piercing, mechanical whine that felt like a needle in my ear, boring straight into soil that had never belonged to them, and I spent the next hour on the phone being bounced around until I finally hit the voice of Nancy Vance, the HOA's new, end quote, environmental liaison, end quote. Nancy was the kind of woman who wore pearls to a community garden meeting and spoke with a brittle, know-it-all confidence that reminded me of every middle manager I'd ever clashed with during my 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. She answered the phone with this tinny, indifferent sigh, telling me, end quote, "I'm not sure why you're being so difficult, Mr. Sterling. This is for the collective benefit of the Valley. It was voted on and approved unanimously," end quote. And when I snapped back that they didn't oppose, T have a right to vote on my dirt, she just paused, cooled her voice to a whisper, and said, end quote, "We have the right under emergency environmental provisions because you sit on the primary aquifer map. You should have checked your email or perhaps your spam folder," end quote. And then she just hung up on me. I didn't oppose. TL, I didn't oppose. T throw my phone. I just went inside and grabbed the heavy leather binder where I kept my original land surveys and boundary markers. And then I made 2 calls, one to the county recorder and one to an old friend named Elias who used to run state infrastructure, a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried when it came to water rights. The next morning, the air didn't oppose. Tea smell like clover anymore. It smelled acrid, thick, and metallic, like someone had cracked open 1,000 rotten eggs and left them to simmer on a hot engine block, and I knew that smell instantly. I walked down to the fence line, my stomach turning and saw a thin, milky yellow sheen creeping out from the borehole, steaming in the morning chill, while the crew worked in respirators, the heavy-duty kind, not the cheap paper ones, and I realized they'd hit something they weren't in Oppos. T prepared for. The foreman, a man named Miller with a neck like weathered leather, met me at the gate they'd actually cut the lock off of overnight, and tried to puff his chest out, telling me I wasn't in Oppos. T authorized to be in the, quote, work zone, and quote, but I just held up my phone, recording everything, from the black sludge they were pumping into a hazmat container to the way the grass was already curling and turning a sickly shade of gray. End quote. You hit a sulfur vein, Miller, end quote. I told him, watching his eyes flicker with a second of pure panic before he masked it with a sneer, end quote. And you're drilling at least 50 feet deeper than any water survey requires. You aren't in Oppos. T looking for a well. You're trying to find a shortcut for the new clubhouse pool, and you've just punctured a pressurized geothermal pocket. End quote. He tried to knock the phone out of my hand, but I sidestepped him, telling him the sheriff was already on his way. And as he turned back to his rig, I looked past him toward the Ridgeview boundary. The HOA's prize-winning ornamental pear trees, the ones they'd spent $40,000 on last fall, were already starting to brown at the tips, and the wind was carrying that toxic, yellow mist right into their pristine cul-de-sacs. By Thursday, the neighborhood looked like a war zone in slow motion. The first tree to go was a 20-foot dogwood right in front of the HOA clubhouse, which is split at the trunk and collapsed like its bones had turned to jelly, and when the roots were exposed, they were black, waterlogged, and coated in that same yellow slime. People were starting to come out of their houses, clutching their throats, complaining about the smell, while the HOA sent out an emergency newsletter calling it, in quote, seasonal soil stress, in quote, and advising everyone to water their lawns less. It was the most pathetic attempt at a cover-up I'd ever seen, especially since the ground was literally soaking in sulfur-rich runoff that was eating the paint off their fence posts. My neighbor from the development, a guy named Gabe who'd always been a bit of a stickler for the rules, came to my fence line looking pale, telling me his kids had been throwing up since Wednesday, and his basement smelled like a chemical fire. And when I told him what the HOA had actually done, how they'd trespassed on my land to save a buck on a project they never disclosed, his jaw just went tight, and he muttered, in quote, they told us it was a routine maintenance check. They never said a word about your property, end quote. I didn't in Oppos. Wait for them to admit fault because I knew Nancy Vance and her board would lie until the water turned to acid. So I overnight my own soil samples to a lab in the city and spent 12 hours a day documenting the, end quote, ghost, end quote, trees, the ones that looked fine on the outside but were rotting from the marrow down. By Friday morning, the lab results hit my inbox like a lightning bolt. Hydrogen sulfide levels that were off the charts, ferric sulfates, and a pH level so acidic it would strip the galvanized coating off a pipe. It wasn't an Oppos. Just a, end quote, leak, end quote. It was a full-scale environmental breach of a deep sulfuric layer that had been sealed for 10,000 years until Miller's drill bit punched a hole in it. Armed with that, I didn't in Oppos. Go to the HOA office. I went to the local news and the Department of Natural Resources, and I didn't in Oppos. Play nice. I showed them the footage of the cut locks, the respirators, and the fake memo, and by that evening, my face was on the 6-0 and Oppos. Clock News, standing in front of a dying forest while the reporter talked about, in quote, suburban negligence, in quote, and in quote, unauthorized drilling, in quote. The board tried to pivot, of course. They sent a VP named Fisher to my house in a silver Mercedes, wearing a blazer that cost more than my tractor, and he actually had the gall to offer me a, end quote, landscaping stipend, end quote, and a new fence if I just sign a non-disclosure and stop talking to the press. I stood on my porch looking down at him, and I asked him if he'd noticed the sycamore in his own backyard was currently shedding its bark in sheets. And when his face went cold, I told him, end quote, I don Oppos. Want your money, Fisher. I want a public admission of trespass. I want a full remediation of the aquifer you've poisoned, and I want your resignation on my desk by Monday morning. End quote. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that told me he still thought he was the one in charge, and he told me, end quote, we have insurance and a legal team that will bury you in paperwork for a decade. Sterling, Don and Oppos. Be a martyr for a patch of dirt, end quote. And he drove off, kicking up gravel like he'd won the round. But Fisher forgot one thing. The land doesn't and oppose. T care about legal teams, and Sulfur doesn't and oppose. T respect property lines. By Sunday, the end quote, seasonal stress end quote, had turned into a full-blown catastrophe as the main water line for the development in oppose. S irrigation system began to corrode from the inside out, blowing 3 separate junctions and flooding the HOA's Central Park with a foot of toxic yellow sludge. The smell was so bad the county had to issue a shelter-in-place order for the lower half of the subdivision. And suddenly, the end quote, fringe outsider end quote, who'd been making noise on the news, was the only one with a clear map of what was actually happening. I started getting knocks on my door at all hours. Neighbors I'd never spoken to, people who'd ignored me for years, all of them scared, all of them asking the same thing. End quote. How do we make them stop? End quote. We formed a coalition right there in my barn, sitting on hay bales and drinking bitter coffee, and we called it, end quote, the Ridgefront Defense, end quote. We shared every email. Every secret memo Gabe had managed to sneak out of the office, and every photo of the boards, end quote, secret, end quote. Landscaping crews who were out at 3 a.m. trying to rip out dead stumps before the state inspectors could tag them. When the State Department of Environmental Quality finally rolled in with 4 white SUVs and a warrant, I was the one who led them to the borehole. I watched Agent Thorne, a woman who looked like she'd eaten granite for breakfast, walk up to Nancy Vance, who was trying to block the drive with her SUV, and hand her a cease and desist that carried the weight of a felony indictment if they didn't and oppose, to comply. They found the backdated permits. They found the missing geological reports that had warned against drilling in that specific quadrant, and they found the invoices proving the HOA had been funneling community, end quote, emergency funds, end quote, into a private shell company owned by Nancy's brother-in-law to do the work. The collapse was spectacular. Within 48 hours, the entire board had resigned to avoid immediate prosecution. The drilling company filed for bankruptcy to shield themselves from the inevitable lawsuits, and the Ridgeview HOA, as a legal entity, was placed into a state-mandated receivership. I sat on my porch a year later, watching the sun dip low over the valley, and while the, end quote, visual cohesion, end quote, of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by patchy lawns and a lot of gravel xeriscaping, there was a different kind of peace now. I'd want a settlement that paid for a brand new, deep-filtered well system and a massive reforestation project on my land. But more importantly, I'd force a clause into the court order that permanently removed my parcel from any future HOA jurisdiction, maps, or, end quote, emergency easements, end quote. I'm still the guy on the ridge, the one who doesn't and oppose. T have a manicured lawn or a matching mailbox. But now when a neighbor's drive-by, they don and oppose. T look away, they wave, and sometimes they stop. To ask how the new cottonwoods are doing, the ones I planted right over the spot where Miller's drill once sat. The land is healing, slowly, but it's a scarred kind of healing, a reminder that you can't puncture the earth without expecting it to bleed, and you can't walk over a man's fence without expecting him to stand his ground. And as for Nancy and Fisher, well, they moved out of the state, but I hear they're still tied up in a class action suit that's going to follow them to their graves. But it makes you wonder, doesn't an oppose? T it? If I hadn't an oppose, T been an engineer, if I hadn't an oppose, T had the records and the stubbornness to fight. That whole valley would be a toxic wasteland by now, and the board would be sipping cocktails by a pool that was literally poisoned from the bottom up. So, I have to ask how many of these, end quote, community boards, end quote, are out there right now, drilling into things they don and oppose. T understand? Assuming you're too tired or too busy to check the deed, is it ever really about the, end quote, collective benefit, end quote? Or is that just a lie they tell to see how much of your world they can own? Drop a comment below if you've ever had to draw a line in the dirt against an HOA or a developer who thought your property was just a suggestion. I want to hear your stories, because out here, the only thing more stubborn than a sulfur vein is a man who knows exactly where his boundary ends and his rights begin.